Hi everyone, how you going? My name's Nick Mitchell, Head of Distribution here at Netwealth. Thanks for joining us today for what's going to be a really special Netwealth Practice Management webinar. Hope you're having a good week. Now with so much news coming out from the Royal Commission, we're really delighted today to be joined by Bernie Ripoll from Map My Plan, who will be sharing a political landscape update and the potential implications for all our businesses, as well as discussing the digital solutions that can help you bring advice to more Australians. Now, before we get stuck into things, I just want to let you know that this webinar is being recorded. Over the course of the slides will be sent with the podcast recording to you within the week. Over the course of today's preso, just feel free to enter the questions in the chat box. We'll do our very best to cover all of those either during the course or at the end of the webinar. If you're posting to social, make sure you use hashtag NetwealthInvest or tweet at NetwealthInvest. From a CPD perspective, this presentation is allocated a CPD point. A question will be sent within the next week for you to claim that CPD point. Now, to introduce our esteemed speaker, Bernie is very well known for being a federal member of Parliament for the seat of Oxley from 1998 to 2016 and was also Parliamentary Secretary to the Treasurer. While in opposition, Bernie was the Shadow Minister for Financial Services and also chaired the inquiry that led to the development of the FoFA legislation, the Ripoll Report. Bernie's a director of Map My Plan, which is based on the premise of separating product from advice and enabling anyone in Australia who wants advice to access it. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to welcome you, Bernie.
Thanks, Nick. Thanks very much. And thanks, everyone, for tuning in. So just up front, this is the first time I've done a webinar, so this will be very interesting. I've listened to a couple of them, but nice to be on the other end of the microphone and see how we go today. So while we should keep questions to the end, I'm happy if people want to send their questions in and we just sort of do that if it helps. That'd be really nice. Maybe just a little bit about me, just a little bit of background. Member of Parliament for nearly 18 years in a fantastic seat, Oxley in Queensland. Just for trivia's sakes, I replaced Pauline Hanson in 1998. And I thought that would be the last we might see of her, at least federally. She was active around the state. But when I left in 2016, she came back and, we're still dealing with her down in Canberra and a whole range of interesting things. And I'll touch a little bit on some of the politics as well. Since I've left Parliament, they call it retirement, but it's not quite retirement as we know it. Since I've left Parliament, I'm doing a range of things. I sit on some boards, continue some charity work that I've been very active in for a lot of years, and I've always had a passion for a very long time around financial services and that interaction between the financial services sector and ordinary people, how it interacts with their financial well-being, their well-being, and certainly their ability to retire more independently. So, that whole big issue around what is financial services all about in the end, and it's about making people's lives better, making sure that people can achieve their goals and a range of things. And I did a whole range of work while I was in Parliament, and particularly around the collapse of Storm Financial and Trio and a range of other things, managed investment schemes and so forth. While I think Australia's got a great financial services sector, I think it's pretty evident we've got some shortcomings and failings, and there's been a whole range of issues, and all of that's culminated in what we've got in front of us today, which is a Royal Commission, which is, just to give the context, a lot of the inquiries that have happened in the past have really been about efficiency and how systems work and things like that. How do we do it better? This Royal Commission really is focused almost entirely on misconduct. This is, it's a massive post-mortem on misconduct. I'd like to think that it's only on behaviour that's historical, but as we're seeing, I think, at least in my view, if we didn't have a Royal Commission, some of that historical misconduct would continue into the future. So I'm certainly a big supporter of the Royal Commission, and we'll see where it takes us. Certainly difficult for a lot of people. So we might just flick over to the next one as well, and just give you a quick political update. And the reason for this is just to have some context around how the two relate. So how does the politics in Canberra relate to what's happening in the financial services sector, and why is it important at all? And the reason I've got Tim Hammond up there, his resignation up first of all, is just to say to you, you just never know what's going to happen in Parliament. It's the most unpredictable, volatile place, I'd say, in Australia. It's continually changing. You can never pick what's going to happen the next day. And just when you think everything's certain, something uncertain happens. So Tim Hammond's, look, he's a good guy. I know him really well. He's a barrister by trade. He worked really hard for about 10 years to get to Parliament. He's gotten to Parliament. He's in the middle of his first term, and he made a real decision, a very, very difficult one, that the cost to his family of him being away from home so often, and in Canberra, he's from Perth, was so great that he would resign. And that was something that was really unexpected. So I'll put that up there just to sort of give you that context. National Party's new leader, Michael McCormick, again, just all this uncertainty and volatility around what happens. What's Tony Abbott up to today? How's the government tracking? They've not only lost, there was that 30 polls in a row, big thing. What would happen? People ask me a lot, what would happen when Malcolm Turnbull got to the 30th poll? I said, well, exactly the same thing that'll happen when he gets to the 31st bad poll and the 32nd bad poll. And I think the government's in a row up to about 63 bad polls. But it doesn't really matter. I mean, it's just polling. As we say, the only poll that counts is on election day. So the Parliament is a very volatile place. The government's got one number majority in the lower house, which means it can pass any legislation it likes, but it just can't get it all through the Senate. The Senate is where it's all done, and that means very hard to predict a good outcome or have any good outcome at all from a government perspective. From a financial services sector, from your perspective, what does that mean? It means anything could happen. It means we could end up with some really bad new laws. It means that depending on when the election is and the findings of the Royal Commission, we could see some things that we don't expect in terms of how the Parliament will decide to deal with business models and how advice is given, and things potentially like the separation of product and advice, or the so-called breaking up of banks, and a whole range of, I think, really serious outcomes, and will have a massive impact on the whole sector. So certainly for institutions, I think that volatility in Canberra is going to have a big impact, if for nothing else, that people really don't know what's coming next. And that uncertainty, we know in the business world, is not something that people are happy with. So just a little bit of a story I thought might be of interest, and it's mostly around one word called hubris. And hubris is an interesting thing, but I got the great privilege of going to Wall Street just before the global financial crisis had hit. And it was a fantastic trip. I got to meet with the heads of everything on Wall Street. I felt very small, insignificant compared to these guys, a little bit naive in a few areas. And I kept asking silly questions like, just explain to me what subprime is, because we don't have it in Australia, and it didn't quite make sense to me. And the consistent answer I got from meeting so many important people was that no, you don't understand. With subprime, you take bad debt, you chop it up, and you just sell it to someone else. And I thought, well, that's fine, but surely someone has to pay back that debt. And they kept saying, no, you don't understand how it works. Bad debt and worse debt, and even worse debt, just keeps getting cut up and sold to someone else. So I'd ask the same question again, but surely someone has to pay it back. No, you don't get it. So that was the consistent response I got, and I won't put on my very bad American accent, but basically I got told that, so this is just pre-GFC, Keynesian economics was dead. Throw the book out the window. It's different this time. There was no end in sight to this boom, and I'm not making this up. These are the comments that I got from very, very senior people, heads of banks, heads of very big wealth management firms. And I thought, wow, maybe I've missed something. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe this is the big change in the world. Just pre-GFC, there seemed to be all this hubris everywhere. It's just amazing. So that's in the United States. Was Australia much different? I'd actually say to you, we weren't much different at all. It's very hard to get people to pull back when they're all making money on markets. The market only seemed to be going in one direction. People were leveraging debt like no tomorrow, double leverage, triple leverage. The things we found from the Storm Financial Inquiry and Apris Ryman Trio, but particularly at Storm, was that, markets only went up. That was what they were saying to people. And, they had this very simple chart of day one, year 100 a market in a straight line from zero to, somewhere up in the blue sky, showing that the market only ever went up historically over time. They just forgot to put all the ups and downs in between. And so we had the same problem in Australia, and then, of course, the GFC hit and everyone woke up to a really bad headache. And, all of that loss and all of that pain that everyone went through at that period of time. And for a lot of reasons since, and it's been 10 years now, that's a decade. Since that time, I don't know that, we've completely fixed all of our systems. I think there's still a lot of problems. I don't think we've learnt all the lessons, but certainly we did a lot of different things. And, things that I learned that we needed, reform. There was no question about that. We needed to change culture, and that's really complicated how you do that. It's very hard to write a law to make people change the way they behave and the way the culture is in an organisation, how it works on an individual level as well as an institutional level. And can it ever happen again? Well, most people will tell you no, because we've had Basel II and Basel III, and governments made a whole heap of legislative changes. FoFA was the big thing that I worked on for a long time, and that's about best interest duty and getting rid of conflicted remuneration, and all painful things, but all in the right direction. So can it happen again or not? That's the big question. So what's happened since FoFA? A lot of things. Some of these things have been put in place because they're desperately needed. So, education standards, qualifications in the financial services sector. RG 186 is just not, it's great to have as an entry level something, but it's probably not the end all be all of what an advisor should look like. And for me, a qualification isn't the end of the story either, because it's not just about having a degree or a qualification. It's about standards. It's about, what are the expectations of people who give advice. BEAR, which is the Banking Executive Accountability Regime, was really put in place by the government, by Turnbull government, really as a SOP against a Royal Commission. So there's a whole heap of things, because we didn't get a Royal Commission early enough, that were put in place to sort of push that thing further and further away. Of course, in the end, we still got the Royal Commission as well. And so there's a whole range of things that people have to deal with, that you have to deal with, that advisors have to deal with. There is a mountain of legislation and there's a mountain of change, some of which is only just now beginning or is about to begin, which will require all of you to do a lot of extra work, a lot of compliance, a lot of more comprehension of what your responsibilities are. And I think it's a much more difficult environment, but it is for a good reason. Look, in the end, we need to understand exactly why all these things are taking place. For me, it's always just about the simple things. It is about a single person's best interest. It is about the consumer, the client, your client. It's about their best interests. It's not necessarily about your best interests. And that message, I think, is still not 100%. It's still not quite making its way through. And we're seeing a lot of that, coming out in the Royal Commission. Just a fee for no service environment where it was deemed okay for not only individuals to perform under that sort of framework, but institutions to knowingly charge people fees when they weren't giving them a service. And it's not acceptable to us individually. We wouldn't want to get charged a fee for having no service. The simplest sort of analogy I can give people is, say you take your car for it's once a year check-up and service, and you pull it into the mechanic in the morning. You pick it up in the afternoon. He says, look, we've done absolutely nothing. We've given you absolutely no service. The car is exactly where you left it, but I'm going to charge you a fee for the day, and it's going to be a pretty big one. That just wouldn't be acceptable. You're expecting something in return. So it's the same in financial services. I think if we start looking at where does all this lead to, and I've put a few points up there for people about policy change and what's different this time, what will come out of the Royal Commission, what's really different. I think this time there's a really genuine bipartisan view on the findings of this Royal Commission and what potentially will come out of it. In the past, there's been the semblance of bipartisanship. Everyone tells me now they're all 100% supportive of FoFA and all the regulations. Didn't feel like it to me at the time, I can assure you. It took a little bit longer than I thought it would to get it all implemented, and I thought we did the right things in terms of giving the sector an opportunity to self-regulate. It is difficult, but self-regulation is always the easiest and cheapest path. But institutions and people sometimes just keep pushing away at doing the right thing or self-regulating, and then it's forced on them by lawmakers through regulation, new laws. But I think post the Royal Commission, we're going to see a really different environment in Canberra where, a bit of chest beating and everyone's going to try and outdo each other. I think, the Liberal and National parties will try to outdo Labor on this, and Labor might try to outdo them. So in other words, my message to you is this: expect some pretty harsh outcomes from what happens in the Royal Commission. So we all know the draft report from Hayne will be in September. The final report is due sometime before February next year. Potentially, the government will do a range of things, either extend the Royal Commission if some more bad things are discovered and the Commission decides it hasn't got enough time to deal with them properly. So we might see an extension, we might see a change of scope, we might see more resources, more money given to Hayne and his Royal Commission. This would be easily supported by everyone in the Parliament. And also, I think, from a political perspective, I think what we'd see is that Malcolm Turnbull and Scott Morrison probably need to take a little bit of ownership of this Royal Commission. They're still seen as the guys who opposed it, and opposed it vehemently, vigorously for a fair while. And, if they want to reap the benefit of the good things that come out of this, they probably need to take a little bit of ownership. So, and I think this the expectation of moving forward. So, how do we again simplify this message? What's the expectations on everyone who's listening in? What's the expectation on you? And I think for me, it's this CS&E, community standards and expectations. What's the community expect of all of us now? What are the sort of standards? That's going to be the new benchmark, and that's the benchmark moving forward. And a couple of other points there that I've got up on screen, that there's an enormous pressure to get this right. You can't just go and have a Royal Commission and sort of do a half-hearted job and do it again in 6 months' time. It's just not reasonable to expect that's going to be the process. So if anything, it will be extended potentially. Scott Morrison's already made some comments that point in that direction, so I think it is a real possibility. Of course, that just means extending the pain for everybody that's involved, and but there's a whole heap of people who obviously want their day in court, and I think while this might be the inquiry to end all inquiries, it doesn't mean it's the last inquiry. This possibly will lead to actually more inquiries in specific areas. It's hard to tell.
I think that touches on a really good point. What's your view on, dare I say, political grandstanding getting in the way of getting the outcomes that the community needs?
Yeah, I look, it's a really good point. I think there is actually a fair bit of that, and we're seeing that right now. I don't want to name names and point fingers, but if I mention a minister, we're all going to know who it is. But look, there is a lot of politicization of these issues. It's really clear what's coming out of Canberra and from certain people that's politicized. I think there's a real battle. It's almost like a war between in the superannuation sector, for example. We've got the Productivity Commission draft report out, which makes some startling, if anything else, findings, which I think the government needs to fully acknowledge. So there's this battle between industry super funds versus retail for profit funds, and I can't see now how we untangle that from the politics. I just can't see how that's possible. But it needs to be. It needs to happen. Now, same in this area. I think in financial services and what happens, FoFA Mark 2, FoFA 2.0. I think this should be the front of people's minds is barely will you have time to digest everything that's actually just been put in place and started and coming, that we're already, the collective we, working on FoFA Mark 2. So I think, this is going to be a really complex and difficult area. I think the politics of it is just poisonous. It was certainly difficult when I was there and working on these issues, but I think it's actually gotten worse. So we'll see how that plays out. Again, I think the possibility of more inquiries and possibly this too, just on Nick's point around this politicisation, the potential that we don't move on, that we actually just get this stalemate thing happening in Canberra where things that need to happen don't happen. And it's an extension of all of this pain. From a personal perspective, what I'd like to see happen is that the Royal Commission reports in February. It makes some really good, solid findings and recommendations. From that, the Parliament decides to, deal with some of the low-hanging fruit that's possibly easier to deal with, and perhaps even does it before the Royal Commission reports. So the government's already moved to do a couple of things in that space, and I think they'll find the right sort of support in the Senate. And on the more difficult things that, post-election potentially, because I think we're going to have an election potentially before the end of the year, that the Parliament really comes together and says, right, for the good of the country and everyone, for their financial well-being, that we can actually move on for some of these issues and get that right. That's my hope. I'm not sure how realistic I'm being. And the last 2 points I've got on there is just, must lead to the focus on clients' best interests. In the end, all of it's just got to, if we have that right at the front of everything we do, I think you protect yourself in a lot of different ways just by doing that. And I want to talk a little bit about trust, but I think that trust in Australia is really broken. Certainly at an institutional level, I think people don't trust much of anything. There's some really good work that's done on measuring all of that, and I might have a chat about it in a minute. So, what are the things that, post the Banking Royal Commission, what's next? Certainly, again, like I said, reform, meeting minimum legal requirements will not be enough, and it just won't be tolerated. That CS&E, community standards and expectations, will be of a high standard. And the real reason for that is that, as we've seen unfold in the Royal Commission, institutions, banks and others, have really lost that privilege to just say, we'll deal with these things internally. And I think the regulators are going to play a larger role than they have in the past. The reason being is that they're under attack. So all of our regulators are under attack. ASIC, APRA, even AUSTRAC. We just saw the AUSTRAC fine. This is a groundbreaking, unbelievable size fine of the CBA, $702.5 million. Scott, it's almost plugged Scott Morrison's budget hole. It's got a long way to plugging the deficit. It's an enormous amount of money. Interestingly, it makes absolutely no difference to CBA. The share price went up as a result. And, the way I look at fining institutions is that it's a bit who cares. $700 million for them, it's just a grain on the sand. It's a tiny amount. It's not their money anyway. It's shareholders' money. I'm being a bit harsh in my language, but they don't care. 700 million, make it $1 billion. So what? They just write it off. It's non-consequential. The only difference that really hits home for institutions is when you go directly for the executive office bearers and directors, and when you say you're on the hook, personally liable. If your institution, if you're found guilty, if you can't negotiate your way out of it, suddenly that changes culture. The $702.5 million fine is just a speeding ticket. It was negotiated out. There's no recorded breach. It's a different context. That's my point. It's a really different context. The other thing too, I think on this, potential issue, for me, probably the biggest one, and certainly something that is close to me and the work we do at Map My Plan in terms of digital advice space, and I'll talk about that a little bit as well in a moment. But this separation of advice and product, I think there's a misunderstanding that the two must live together. That you give advice in order to sell a product, or that every product needs advice. It can actually be that you just give advice, that you don't have to attach any product at all to that advice, that the advice to someone might be, and my view again is all advice is personal advice, and Map My Plan certainly has that philosophy, and we're licensed and so forth, and and we don't shy away from this thing about it's all about personal advice. How can you talk to someone about any advice and not be personal? This whole general advice thing, I think, is rubbish, and we're seeing that unfold as well. So, and on penalties and regulatory oversight, I think in terms of fees, we're seeing an environment where fees are continually being pushed down. So whatever revenue model, whatever business model you got in place, if you haven't already put that into your risk register or your matrix, or however you look at these things and say, what's going to happen to our fees in the future? Well, certain fees you might always be able to, charge more. So if your services, you might say we're really good and we charge, high fees because we give a great service and people appreciate that and will pay for it. But on a lot of other fees that are built-in fees or percentage fees, there's a lot of pressure, admin fees, for them to just keep coming down. And that'll come from two places: regulatory pressure around fees, and the other one is technology pressure around fees. And in some parts of advice or products, you'll see some of those fees approach zero, because the cost of delivering it, it's only the first bit of advice that really costs you the big whack of dough. Every other piece of advice after that is a diminishing cost return. So it's, I think there's a lot more for us to see in that space as well. So what's the new advice landscape look like? So let's have a look at it. So the new advice landscape, a lot of it's going to be built around trust. And do you trust your advisor? Do you trust the advice you're getting? Do you trust? And it's actually a difficult concept, trust, because in Western democracies like Australia and other places, we actually give away trust so we use it every day, but we give it away as a concept because we rely on, rather than trust, we rely on the separation of powers in our legal system and in our parliamentary system of democracy and so forth. So I'm not going to dwell on it and give you a whole sort of expose on separation of powers, but the whole concept is that we have trust in our systems and we have trust in our institutions, and mostly it's because we don't trust people, because people will do us wrong, but generally an institution wouldn't. Certainly technology won't do you wrong. And so there's a growing trust in technology, and the Edelman Trust Barometer, Edelman Institute, this fantastic global network, and they've been measuring trust around the world for 15 or 16 years now, and it's a very deep, rich database. It's got some really interesting findings. So they do one which is a country-based trust measure. So, what's the most trusted country in the world? And they just do a sliding scale. What's the least trusted? So, pop quiz. What's the least trusted country in the world, just recently? Quick answer, it's Russia. It's Russia. People, the informed and the not so informed, very close results, don't trust their own country. What that really means, they don't trust their institutions, they don't trust their politicians, they don't trust. So there's probably no real surprise there. The most trusted country in the world probably will surprise you. So it's the same metrics, same analysis, same everything. It's China. China's the most trusted country by its own people. And if you think about it, it actually makes sense. Trust is based around certainty, and Chinese people are very certain about their future. They're certain about their government. They know it's not changing. There's no coups. They know what they've got. They've got 5-year plans. They can all go and have a look at the 5-year plan. They know for the next 5 years. So they've got this really high level of trust. There's not a lot of volatility. So generally speaking, China's right at the top end of the trust barometer. Russia is right at the bottom. There was a big change this year in terms of the biggest change ever in the 16 years they've been measuring trust. What's the newest country at the bottom of the trust barometer? And it's the United States. And it's had the biggest ever change, and it's obviously since Trump was elected. So he might be a populist and he might have won the election, but the levels of trust have just fallen through the floor.
It's interesting to see technology there, and there's some statistics about how people will trust Google or Amazon or Facebook with their money more than they might their financial institution, which is, a blight on what it is we do every day.
Yeah.
Post Cambridge Analytics, do you think technology is going to have a bit of a negative spotlight shined on it in that regard? Purely from a trust perspective.
Yeah. Actually, I think no. I don't think there's going to be a loss of trust in technology. I think there'll be a loss of trust again in certain companies or certain groups of people, but I think the technology will absolutely be trusted. And as we're seeing really quickly evolve, we're trusting our credit cards and other debit cards on our smartphones, and we're trusting the payment system without fail, 100% trust that actually will work. Instant receipt on your phone, you can track it. There's a high level of trust in that, and this trust barometer here, it's technology right at the top of that. So this is in Australia too, by the way. Low trust financial services, no surprise. And this is in the business sector. So in the business sectors, this is what it looks like. The most of the four sectors that are measured, the highest is NGOs. The next one is business, which is a higher trust. Coming in third, believe it or not, is government, and last is media. People don't trust media. They don't trust any news. Every time you read something, according to people that measure these things, is you look for a counter to that. And in fact, I just heard the other day that Elon Musk is starting up a news filtering system whereby people who read the news will rate how true that piece of news is. And so you'll have this trusted format of news where each piece of information and news is ranked by everybody else. So it's sort of like a blockchain version, a ledger where it self-verifies itself. And I thought, wow, that's a really interesting concept. But this is how far trust has gone. We've lost trust in information that we get, not the technology, though. So as long as I think it's really important on that scale. Financial services has got a lot of work to do. The big threat for everyone's business model in terms of looking at that chart is, if I can be blunt, people are going to trust you less and less, but they're going to trust technology more and more. Hence the rise of whatever it might be, robo-everything, robo-advice, robo-product advice, robo-asset management, technology-based platforms, which do, for me, two really important things. One is the ability to deliver on scale. In the modern world, you can't. Face-to-face is the ultimate interaction, two people talking to each other, but we're all limited in what we can do and provide that. You can't do 1 million people in a week. You can through technology and platforms. So this is more just to give people some sort of a sense around how these things interrelate. Often I'm asked, okay, that's all great, but why is this important? How does it relate to what how do I get a context around all of these things? So one of my favourite government reports is actually done by Treasury. It's called the Intergenerational Report, and they do it every 5 years, and it's a forward-looking crystal ball into the future. Looks forward 40 years with everything we know today. What might Australia look like in 40 years' time? There's some interesting things that come out of it. This one in particular for me. So apologies for my graphics, but in 1975, for every one person, not two people, the couple that you see up top, for every one person aged 65 years or over, in other words, no longer contributing to that tax system, there were 7.3 people, workers, contributing to the tax system. So that was the sort of balance. Today, graphically, it makes it pretty obvious. For every one person over 65, 4.5 workers, but by 2055, it's predicted there'll only be 2.7 people in the workforce, i.e. the ability to pay tax and contribute for every one person aged 65 or more. What makes it even more sort of startling is if you understand that our longevity risk profile, we are all living longer, and that's the best problem in the world to have. But by 2055, it's expected there'll be twice as many 65-year-olds, 4 times as many 85-year-olds. It's a big number. And 1 in every 1,000 people will live to be 100 years of age. Now, that should tell you a lot. Just that little bit of information, that snapshot, about health costs, rising health costs, about aged care, about our tax system, and then take all of that. And if you ever wanted a real good explanation as to why a financial advisor's job is so important, it's because of all these reasons. Because people are going to be out of the workforce for potentially 35 years or more. Now, if you've worked for 40 years, but you're going to be out of the workforce for maybe even 40 years, who's going to sustain your lifestyle standard of living? So this is for me, it's the big standard of living chart. I can't see how in the future we're going to maintain our current standard of living unless we do some things really differently going forward. So why is getting financial services right so important? It's because of that. I think we've all become complacent in the thinking that because we live in Australia and it's the lucky country and we've always done well, reasonably well, certainly compared to most others, that it'll just always be the case. And the reality is it just may not be. And current trends actually indicate it won't be. The standard of living for our children will be less than ours. The standard of living for their children will be less than them. That's what it looks like if you chart it all out and you move forward. So now that I've depressed you all, let me give you some more bad news. What do our jobs look like in the future? And we always tend to think that it always happens to other people. Change is constant. It's hard to see it coming. By the time change gets here, it's too late. We've missed it, just like the taxi industry did. If change was forced onto the taxi industry, we all know it. It's the one that people probably know the best. Uber. What have I noticed has changed in the taxi industry since Uber come on board? I'm generalising here, but taxi driver service has improved. The cars are cleaner, and a whole range of other things. The service is sharper, and costs are sort of balancing out, and there's a whole range of things. Technology has driven that change, and no matter what the taxi industry did to push it away, ban Uber, do everything you like, talk to governments, lobby governments, get it all happening. In the end, everybody won. Uber won in that sense because the change happened because it was being driven from a place that can't be stopped through technology. Hotel industry is pretty much the same. Yes, there's new rules, regulations. They've got to pay their tax. Yes, all of that's fine, but it still has had the impact. It's meant that hotels have to change the way they do business. The retail sector, Uber Eats, that's changing the way that restaurants operate and the way that they prepare meals. So even high-end five-star restaurants now, subscribe to Uber Eats and others. There's Deliveroo, and I'm not advocating for any of them in particular. Financial services, of course, and I've mentioned it before, but I'm calling it robo everything because there's a lot of confusion out there as to, people use the general descriptor of robo advice, but really, there's distinctive parts to that, and there's sort of robo investors, there's robo personal financial management, different platforms, and then there's actual advice, so like financial coach advice, so there's asset management, there's different platforms, not the one thing, but it's already changed our environment and it will change it significantly going forward. You can see it in the superannuation industry with Gig Super and a range of others. Sure, they're small, their fees are really high, but it's like electric cars. The first few are going to be expensive and difficult to get, but as the sector moves on, we're going to see a really big change. So what does the future look like? I'm not 100% sure. I don't really know. I'm not a futurist, but I've got some idea. I think we're going to see further automation. It'll be automating all the things that are tedious, time-consuming, things we don't like doing, paperwork, compliance, all those sort of things. Machine learning, certainly, it's there now, and we're going to see more competition, but it's going to be competition from within and without. It's going to be competition from everywhere. When you start talking technology, you're no longer limited by who can compete with you. Size and capital are no longer the barriers that they might have been in the past. And certainly with Map My Plan, we're only small, but delivering advice through a technology platform means that we can just reach incredible numbers of people really, really fast, and we can morph and adapt really quickly. We get feedback, something doesn't work, we can change it, and we can compete more. Certainly a more open and transparent market, I think, in the future. And I mentioned it earlier, but I think we're going to see this increased pressure on ASIC and APRA, but let's just say ASIC for what we're talking about mostly, that they'll be much more pervasive in their approach to your business. And we're going to see much more scrutiny. I mean, these are the things that develop out of what's currently going on. And really importantly, consumers are waking up and they're demanding more, and they're demanding more for less. And they're walking with their feet. And I think we're going to see potentially the breaking apart of the models that kept people into a particular field, and where fees were charged and sort of everyone was asleep and no one really knew, and just fees were taken out. Those days are behind us, even if you're still doing it now. Those days are really well and truly gone. If you're still in that space, or you've got money for jam, let's call it, have a look at what happens when that disappears in the next 2 years. So that's a really big, again, put the thinking cap on here, look to the future. Whatever you've got now that's coming in where you think it's just a little bit too easy, it'll probably disappear. New entrants to the market, obviously, and I think this whole issue of loyalty to existing traditional providers, I discovered this really, there is no loyalty. That's basically it. I think we've seen the end of loyalty. Loyalty programs are there for a reason, because they're trying to create loyalty where people's loyalties are gone. I don't know which airline you fly. You don't have to tell me.
Starts with Q.
Yeah, but the loyalty that used to exist on flying particular airlines is disappearing. And so they're working harder and harder to try and keep people on board. Well, it's the same in financial services. And we're going to see that done in different ways as well. So, I think this is a really big open space here for me, and I think there's the potential for a lot of things to change in the future. So, FinTech, you're probably all going, God, we really don't like these FinTech guys. They're coming in, interrupting what we're doing in our business models, and are we friends or foe? This is a little snapshot. KPMG did this Australian FinTech landscape, because if we did a global one, it's just too big. But this one will just show you in different segments and sectors just how many FinTechs there are out there, whether it's insurtech or middle and back office, crowdfunding, wealth tech. It's just, and it's developing out every single day. There's somebody new coming on the market. Look, this probably should scare everyone, because it means you've got a lot of competition out there. There's a new guy out there right now who's developing a platform which might just knock over your business. And you won't know they're there. They're probably working at Stone and Chalk in Sydney, or I don't know what the equivalent here is in Melbourne, but FinTech hubs in Brisbane, River City Labs, others, they're just popping up everywhere. And there's really clever people who are either young and clever and got great new ideas about their own subset, their own culture, their own peers, young people who don't subscribe to the same things that we've subscribed to in the past, about saving for a house or, putting more money into your super. They're subscribing to a different view of the world, or they're actually coming from the sector, and perhaps they've, seen the light, and they're saying, wow, we used to do it the old way, we're now going to go do it a new way. So that's just to give you a snapshot. And this is a little bit old now. There's a lot more out there than this. So in the FinTech world, a couple of the key ones, obviously RegTech is a really new area, but has a lot of potential. I know ASIC are themselves looking at blockchain technology and how they can use that to keep people in their compliance frameworks. There's, I can see a point in time very soon where if you're not using some sort of regulatory bit of technology, then you're at risk, and the at risk is that you're either not meeting or not keeping up to date, or it's costing you too much. On the advice tech side, I think we're going to see some of the larger institutions and the bigger players that everyone's into this space somewhere. It's certainly going to have an impact on traditional advice, and maybe if I can just pull some context around here. So with Map My Plan, we're a self-directed digital advice platform where you don't need any human beings. But at the same time, we say we don't compete with human beings. We don't compete with face-to-face advice. We're there to support it. We're there to actually, give people more opportunity. On the compliance side, it's the same. A lot of work being done, and obviously, what it's designed to do is to make advice businesses operate better in that space. And there's a lot of competition developing out there. And robo-advice, as I said, is there. It really shouldn't be seen as trying to take your job. It should be there as enhancing your job. So what are the big fights of the future? What will it look like for your business? I think there's some really significant, really big fights to happen yet. They haven't, everyone's just walking in the ring. We don't really know where this is going to go yet. It's not even round one, really. Around regulation and competition, as I said right at the start, more reviews, more change, competition from everywhere. And you're going to see the regulators taking a very different approach in the future on how they interact with businesses. So to give you an example of that, it might just mean that they'll take people's licenses off them more readily, or put more restrictions on people's licenses, or AFSLs, and maybe even with the large institutions, ban them from doing certain things for certain periods of time. So I think we're going to see a lot more in that space. I think fees and fee commissions and a range of other things, keep thinking of that big number 0. I'm not saying we're going to get to 0, but I'm saying we're going to start approaching 0 through technology and through competition, and that your skills and knowledge and ability is really what's going to help you to manage that. So it's going to be the value add. What value you're providing for the service that you're giving. It's the more for less argument. Technology and automation, I think we've discussed that, and restoring trust. For me, this is hand in hand with everything that's going on. Everyone needs to participate. You can't be a bystander when it comes to these things. It's the small things that drive the big outcomes, as we're seeing through the Royal Commission. So just a little bit of a plan from My Plan in terms of surviving and thriving. This is how we do things. It may not be different to how you do things. Really, it is about that user interface, and it is about people, whether you do that through a platform or whether you do it face-to-face or however you do that. It's really about, knowing your client better, understanding what their needs are, and understanding too that people are changing, demographics are changing. So what might continue to work in the future for your existing client base may not work at all for their children when they inherit the wealth that's coming to them in the next generation. And we're going to see the biggest wealth transfer in history, from the boomers and the X's through to the millennials. Proactive advice, it's that interaction, running reports, understanding what's going on, and having solutions for people where they need it as well. And education. Education is a key part and a really important part of not only for your clients, but for your own people. That ongoing education piece is, I think, critical. So that's it from me. Hopefully we got the time just right, and we're happy to answer some of your questions.
Thanks, Benny. That's great. Now, we do have a bunch of questions come through and a bunch of thoughts as well, so we appreciate those coming through. And I think, Daryl, your comment certainly about creating trust by making sure you do the right things by clients every single day, and the clients will be better off and have to be better off after seeing you certainly rings true, and there's no question about that. Really good point. Question from Ben, Bernie. What are your thoughts on advisors being directly licensed by ASIC, as in the abolishment of all licensees?
Yeah, that's a great one. Thanks for that question. I think that's a real possibility. I think we might see some sort of a hybrid system where there's an AFSL, for a licensee, that type of global license we've got now, and that individuals then have some sort of subcategory license or a license which says they meet a certain standard or qualification or something, and that might include some professional development. So for me, the key point there, and I haven't mentioned it so far in this presentation, but it's this issue of professionalism. Do we want this to become a profession? And if it is going to be, if that's the ultimate goal, and it certainly has been in my thinking right from the start, then if you're going to be part of a profession, you have to be a professional. And professionals often, not always, but are licensed and have different standards that they have to adhere to. So I think that's a real possibility and something we should all keep an eye on.
Another question's come through from Peter. This is a really interesting one. I know it's been the topic of a very hot topic, especially with the education requirements and the conversation around that. Peter's made a comment. Advisor Ratings recently reported that up to 14,000 advisors are going to leave the industry due to either their age and those new education standards. Pretty frightening number. How do you see that sort of playing out for consumers in the advice community if that happened?
Yeah. So, I've seen that number as well. Look, there's another number out there also, which is in the past 12 months, there's actually been an increase in the number of financial advisors in the marketplace and the number of licenses that have been issued. So it's sort of a counter to that. Whatever the number is, whether it's 14,000 or some other number that leave, there'll be others to replace. They'll just be, perhaps under a different context. But I don't see a mass exodus at one point in time of everyone leaving the sector and consumers being left out in the cold. I think it's a transition. That's going to be closer to the reality. There'll be some that leave because of, they'll just want to retire and, move on, do other things. Others may decide because of the education standards they no longer want to participate in the sector, but there'll be a whole new group of young people coming out of universities and other sectors, related sectors, where they see a rising level of professionalism and want to become a financial advisor for those reasons. And I think that's also a reality.
Yeah, I strongly suspect that number of 14,000 advisors is probably based on people's current educational levels.
Yeah.
So it does sound like a pretty bloody big number.
Very large.
A couple more questions coming through. Do you believe the government's going to scrap upfront and ongoing commissions on life insurance products?
A couple of parts to that. So we already had the Trowbridge report and the government moving on some of those about clawbacks and about upfront commissions and reducing those. That's always a potential. So the answer would be, is it potential the government could do this? The answer is yes. I think they'll be a bit more measured, like what we've seen as the outcome through the life insurance framework and from emanating out of the Trowbridge report. Certainly there will be less upfront, and certainly clawback mechanisms as we've currently got in place. And I think that it'll be a more difficult space to operate in. There's no question about that. And given that insurance is a difficult space anyway, it's a push product rather than a pull product. And I think there'll be less benefit up front. It'll be more about keeping people in a product rather than just flogging it to them on day one.
Yeah, sure. Here's an interesting question from Jeff. Thanks, Jeff. Bernie, can you highlight a few exciting specific examples of reg tech, compliance tech, advice tech businesses, apart from At My Plan, of course? What sort of problems are they solving?
Yep. So they're solving the complexity around either paperwork or lodgement or the interaction piece. So there's some compliance tech and some reg tech startups out there now that are actually looking at how do we make it easier for an advice business to actually deal with that through a platform and a piece of technology. And a lot of that too would be about how the record keeping elements of it and how that interaction happens then with the regulator. I've spoken to ASIC a number of times around that particular space. They see this evolving really rapidly and see that it would be beneficial to everybody, including them as the regulator, to have people on different platforms. So while they're not picking any winners, I think that's really a space to watch. I don't have any specific one to give you, but if you have a look at that KPMG FinTech chart, it's actually got a range of businesses in there that are currently working in that space.
Bernie, here's a question from Ben. I don't know if you have any thoughts, but what are your thoughts on advisors being directly licensed by ASIC, i.e. the chopping out of licensees? Do you think that's...
So that's a slightly different question. So if it's individually licensed and the getting rid of licensees, that's really different to, perhaps having licensees. I think there needs to be, if anything, there needs to be both. So you would still have an institution that would need a license to be able to provide the services it's claiming it provides. And then people who put themselves forward as professionals or experts or able to give that sort of advice or sell a particular product or whatever it is they say they're doing, that they have some sort of a licensing regime as well. I see that as a real potential. I don't think it's exclusive, that it's one or the other. I think we're going to see a hybrid model of both.
Yeah, sure. Now, one of the questions come through from Alan. Thanks for sending it through, Alan. 5 years on now from FoFA. What's your take now, sort of in being able to look back with hindsight? How do you think those reforms have improved the professionalism of the industry? What's been the end client result?
Well, after 5 years, I don't think I think it's been really important. I think I not only look back at it and think we did a really good job, and we were trying to be as compliant as possible. As in, the Parliament, to give an opportunity to the sector to be able to manage the transition and understand the difficulty in the soft launch and some self-regulation. It probably hasn't achieved everything I would have liked to have achieved just yet. But when you're trying to change culture, as I said right at the start, that's a really difficult thing to do. You can't just write that in black letter law. It takes big shifts, and I think that's happening right now. So it's only 5 years. It's only from when we really first kicked it off to now. I think the real question will be in 5 years' time, and of course I'd couch all of that in the context that before the ink's even really dry on FoFA, there's going to be FoFA Mark 2. We're seeing that evolve right now. So it's a run fast environment of catch up on everyone's responsibilities.
Yep. Bunch of questions coming in. Keep them coming. Really appreciate it. I'm just going to try and work through them. You made a comment before about general advice versus specific, and that any advice is specific. Do you think there's going to be delineation between those two phrases in the future, or will general advice go the way of the dodo and disappear?
Yeah, I'd like to think so in a lot of ways, because general advice in a way is meaningless. I think it's a cop-out. I think if you give any advice, it's personal. How can it be just general? It's if you're talking to someone directly or you're advising them on a particular product that you're selling them, then it's personal advice. There might be tiers of advice levels, but in the end, all advice is personal, and already we're seeing that evolving out. We're already seeing, the real distinction that more and more advice is just personal advice. I don't think there should be any grey area at all. I think people who are in the advice business shouldn't be giving general advice. They're being paid to give personal advice. When I was an MP, I gave general advice, and there was no legal requirement around that general advice. People would come in and ask me about things all the time. What should I do about this? What should I do about that? What about my super? What about this? I'd say, well, I can't advise you on those things, but I can point you to people who can, or to an industry sector or a peak body, or there's ways you can help people. I think in my mind anyway, there's a really clear distinction between doing that and then giving people some advice which leads them to buy a product.
Yep. We are running out of time. A quick comment on regulations on accountants. I know there's some consternation about their ability to give advice. Obviously, your answer on general advice might answer that question itself. Do you think there's going to be increased regulation on what accountants can and can't be saying?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. No, I think, again, it's this question of what is it that you're licensed to do, or what is it that you're purporting to do? So if you're going to give personal advice, then you ought to be licensed to do that. Being an accountant does not license you to give personal advice. Originally, we had a carve-out for accountants in terms of a range of different areas in the regulations. That's disappearing. Accountants need to meet the same standard as everyone else. So if you're an accountant, you do what you say you're going to do. If you then are transversing into the advice space, you either have your own license and you're licensed to give advice, or that person then has to go and see somebody else. Now, we know what happens in the locked privacy of a room between two individuals. Sometimes that it's the old nudge, nudge, wink, wink. But those days are pretty well gone, because the liability you carry by doing things in that way now is just too great. So I think we're going to see a much neater separation. That's already happening between what accountants can and can't do, who can give advice and who can't give advice, and what that advice relates to.
Yeah, sure. Now, just one final comment from you would be great. The Royal Commission, there's a few questions that have come in about the likely ramifications of what those changes are going to look like. And I guess their broader impact as well, other financial advice related industries like broking, real estate, general insurance. Where will this end, and will it only end when, as you said, client's best interest is the absolute first thing that every single licensed advisor in the country focuses on?
Yeah, probably the easiest way to answer that is that the Royal Commission is not just about advisors, because otherwise, we might all get this impression that it's just about you guys. I mean, it's not. Mortgage brokers are in. There's a whole range of things. So superannuation as well, what happens in super, insurance space, all of that. The tie-in is right. It is really about the best interests of individual people, your clients, regardless of which space you're operating in. But there's no doubt now. There's no doubt at all now that mortgage broking, for example, needs to be examined closely, and let's see how much time and energy Hayne devotes to that particular stream. Insurance within superannuation, there's already been some reviews, but how will that look like after this? And just fees on insurance and advice on insurance. So all of those areas are going to be examined, particularly around this concept of misconduct, and then it really will be to try and expose all of that and give us all an opportunity to fix it, to make it a better marketplace. So it's not just going to be about advisors. Obviously, they're usually the focus point of a lot of these discussions, but I think it's all in, and that's what really the Royal Commission's about, all in. Let's get rid of that misconduct.
Bernie, it's very contentious. It's very topical. We certainly appreciate your very candid views, your transparency. Really appreciate you having you along today. To everyone who's joined us, a huge thanks. As mentioned earlier, the webinar is being recorded, and slides are recording, and the podcast recording will be sent out to you within the week. And as well as your CPD point as well, that questionnaire will come out also in the next week. So once again, Bernie, thanks so much for coming. Thanks everyone for joining in. Have a fantastic week. We'll see you later on.
Thank you.